So we've heard quite a bit today about a lot of new innovations coming to market. And with every one of those innovations, a conversation I usually have with board of directors or the C-suite is how are you protecting them? A lot of these devices are going to connect either over the internet, through Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, or maybe even new things like mesh networks. So it's not always the devices themselves, but in those communications that they become vulnerable to security hacks. So first, I'm going to talk about the landscape we see today in cybersecurity types of attacks. Now, I know we all hear about many of them in the news every day. And most of the time, we're hearing about these types of data breaches, personal identifiable information being stolen. But there's a lot more to it than spear phishing and malware attacks. So a few I'd like to go over. First of all, ransomware. That's where they encrypt your data, ask for ransom. It's actually very easy to detect and stop ransomware using new technologies because it's a brute force type of attack on your network. The trick with ransomware is it moves so very fast, it's hard for your human security teams to keep up with the pace. But other types of attacks are more silent, more subtle. For example, trust attacks. A great example of that is what we saw with the DNC, the Democratic National Committee. With that type of attack, it wasn't really simply about data theft. It was about how do you get people to lose trust? In this case, trust in democracy. Well, what you can see with trust attacks is they don't just happen to the DNC. In fact, trust attacks can be targeted at executives. They can be targeted at companies to try to get them to lose brand trust or reputation. And I think trust attacks we'll see will continue on the rise. The trick is they're very targeted, very specific, very hard to detect. Next is insider threat. We all like to trust the employees who work for us. But we also have employees that sometimes start with good intentions and may become malicious over time. Or maybe someone just does something by accident that leaves the network vulnerable. So there's all different types of insider threat. The hard part with insiders, they already have credentials. They're already inside your network. And by the way, they often know the data they're looking for. Finally, the last type of attacks are artificial intelligence attacks. We often talk about the use of AI for good, but what happens when some of these entities, possibly even at the nation state level, start to incorporate artificial intelligence in the attacks themselves? Right now, we have trouble keeping pace with human attackers. Imagine now those same type of attacks being able to learn and listen inside of networks, get smarter, and evolve on their own. That day is coming. In fact, we saw our first signs of an AI attack in India in a network about 6 months ago. And while that was kind of a fundamental basic one, it used machine learning to blend in the background of a very noisy network. Had it gone undetected, that attacker could have just stayed inside that network, learned and listened. And what that often means is they're gaining knowledge of intellectual property, of unique business practices, the types of things all of us value very highly in this room. That day will come. We don't know if it'll be in 2018 or 2020 or beyond, but we have to anticipate AI will be used as part of the attacks in the future. Okay, now that I laid out all the doom and gloom up front, there's very good news about this. In fact, if we look at our own human bodies, for millions of years, humans have been protected by our immune system. Now, the immune system has a very innate sense of self. My immune system understands me, it understands my DNA, it travels the world with me, and it knows what bacteria and viruses I'm exposed to. And although I have skin that does a great job of protecting me, eventually some of those bacteria or viruses find their way inside. The immune system then kicks in, and it creates antibodies. This approach is exactly how Darktrace works. We use artificial intelligence and deep learning to actually emulate the human body's immune system. The way we do that is it actually is software that installs inside a network, and it builds what we call a pattern of life of every user and every device. And over time, a very short period of time, it learns what's normal for that user and device. It establishes the pattern of life. Now, when something changes off that pattern of life, it automatically detects it. But most importantly, it's just not about finding the threats. What do you do when the AI finds a threat? Well, this is where we think the future is for artificial intelligence, and we have this working inside corporate networks today. It's the area of autonomous response. You heard earlier about autonomous vehicles. Well, very similar concept. This is how do you actually have the artificial intelligence learn from humans how they would take a response and automatically enable the machine to fight back. We actually have this running now, this AI approach to cyber defense using human immune system in nearly 4,000 corporate networks of all different sizes, from 10 employees up to 400,000 employees in all different industries. Now I'm going to switch gears a little bit because we're here to talk quite a bit about data. So I want to explain a little bit about the approach that Darktrace has taken from the data perspective. So the first thing is, we figured out that when we decided to take this human immune system approach, it wasn't about historical data. It wasn't about training data sets. In fact, they didn't exist. Now, there were other companies using AI looking at historical data, but we thought about that. If you're looking at yesterday's attack on somebody else, is that really any different than today's method of using rules or signatures? And yet we still see all these attacks happening. Why? Because when you get into cyber defense, what you realize is yesterday's attacks are not necessarily an indicator of tomorrow's threat. Never mind that they don't find the insider threat, the human error, the misconfigurations in your firewall. But also the attack vectors change so rapidly, and that's why we're having trouble as human security teams keeping up. So what that meant is we actually had to create our own data set, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But we also use unsupervised machine learning, which I'm finding out as I talk to other AI companies and venture capitalists, there's not that many companies applying unsupervised machine learning. What that means is you have no prior knowledge. It has to learn on the job or learn on the fly in real time. And that's a very different style of AI, but it's very powerful. The next thing we did was we created a separate deep learning lab, separate from our R&D team. They have 20 different projects they're working on. And in addition to what we call augmenting the human security team, which is what we do today, what do we do to actually automate the AI threat analyst? How do we automate the human in AI? So we have a project called Project Turing, and what it does is we've hired about 80 of the world's leading threat analysts. Many of them came out of CIA, NSA, military intelligence, or in Britain, GCHQ and MI5. And we've been having the artificial intelligence watch them now for the past 4 years. And what it does is it learns from them. And the interesting thing is we don't use the concept of good and bad, because what was good yesterday may be bad tomorrow. We felt that was another antiquated technique that wasn't really working in cyber defense. So what we had to do is say, this is interesting. We have no prior knowledge of it. Is this benign or concerning? And that's where this learning from the humans becomes really important, because now we can start to decipher benign versus interesting. So the data set that we use, and this is actually a screenshot from our product, we take the raw network traffic. We analyze 400 data features from each packet in real time. Now, for those of you who are kind of geeky and follow things like NetFlow has 20 to 30 data features. And guess what? The hackers know which 20 or 30 all these tools are using. So by using 400 data features, we actually correlate them And so we're taking multiple weak indicators of threat correlated together to gain the highest confidence of probability that this is actually something detrimental and concerning inside the network. Now, one thing that I often get asked, especially by VCs, and I know we have a mix of CEOs and founders of companies and VCs in the audience, is why wouldn't Amazon and Google own every AI market there is because they've got the biggest data set? Well, I think cyber defense is one of those great areas of examples where having those types of data sets that they have are virtually irrelevant, quite frankly, when it comes to learning in real time from the inside of each network. Because guess what? No two networks are alike. It's really messy data. And the only way we could learn that is by installing in thousands of networks, analyzing millions and millions of devices, and the unique patterns of life that each individual has. So it's kind of a good example or use case of how we might need to look at AI a little bit differently than just assuming it's all about training data sets. Now for the fun part. As I mentioned, we've deployed this in nearly 4,000 corporate networks. I'd like to give you some real-world examples of types of things the AI has found inside of these networks. So this is a Raspberry Pi device, and one of the things that we see happening is people are bringing in consumer devices or devices they might use in their home into the company, and they're plugging it straight into the network. Well, this is the case with Raspberry Pis. We're actually seeing more and more of these. Now, in some cases, it's for absolutely valid business use. For example, we're working with a digital media customer in San Francisco, and one of their digital designers wanted to project from his smartphone onto a monitor or screen to show his campaign he had created. So he brought in a Raspberry Pi to do that projection. Okay, so our AI spotted that as anomalous and unusual because other people hadn't plugged in Raspberry Pis and weren't using them in that way. But you might say, well, I don't want to know about that alert if I'm in the security team. That's just a waste of my time. But actually, what it actually helped us know was that they hadn't changed the default password. That now means that any attacker scanning the network for IoT devices that were insecure could jump onto this and use that as a leaping off point to do lateral movement inside of that network. So you do want to know about it. But let me give you another example with a Raspberry Pi. So we had a customer, and it was a very secure data center. In fact, they used biometrics to enter the data center. And we started seeing 2 Raspberry Pis that looked like they were coming from the data center, and they were siphoning off small amounts of data every day. But we detected them because they were the only 2 devices in the data center that looked like Raspberry Pis that were behaving this way. We actually got in a bit of a confrontation with the security operation team in this account because they said there's no way we'd allow Raspberry Pis in our data center. Well, it turned out we said we see them, we know they're there, we can see the traffic, on the screen. And so we wrote a geolocation device and found that the Raspberry Pis were inserted under the floorboards in the data center. Now, at that time, Darktrace was politely asked to leave. All of our data was turned over to the FBI. And it turns out one of their privileged users who had accessed this data center had received a $50,000 bribe from someone on the outside to place the Raspberry Pis under the data center floorboards. The reason I bring up these type of examples, you are not going to find these using your run-of-the-mill malware detection, antivirus software. But these are the types of stealthy, silent things lurking in networks that are going missed that later cause huge problems. So this raw network traffic is what really gives us this immense visibility to find these types of threats. The next one I want to talk about is one that might not be as dramatic as the floorboards of the Raspberry Pi, but this one we had a Shark Tank in a casino that was another IoT device, and we were deployed there. Now, I kind of said, why would you have a Shark Tank IoT device? And one of the reasons is it actually watches the chemical levels in the water. It has the feeding time schedule. So there were valid reasons that it was connected to this Internet of Things device. However, again, the network was scanned. The attacker broke in through the shark tank, jumped onto the corporate network, laterally moved, and likely, being it was a casino, was after the high roller database. Eventually, they found some of what they were looking for, and they actually started exporting this data, in this case, to another country. Again, we were able to detect this before the data left the building. It was clearly anonymous activity for the fish tank to start laterally moving around the network, looking for a high roller database. Now, many of you might deal with Bitcoin or cryptocurrency as part of your business models, but we are seeing an increase, not just in Bitcoin for payment of ransomware, but there's a lot of people that want to get in the Bitcoin mining or manufacturing part of this because it's very lucrative. But in this day and age, you actually need massive compute power and processing power to do so. So in this particular case, this happened to be a European bank. Someone broke in to the bank. We don't even know if they knew it was a bank they had landed in. And what they did was take over the computing power in order to manufacture Bitcoins in the evening. By the way, we saw that 2 years ago. Then it took a while. We saw it pop up in a couple other international banks. We now see this mainly in the United States, but it's not outsiders breaking in. It's often privileged users, system admins, who kind of think maybe there's no harm in taking over some of this compute power in the evening when the systems are underutilized to get in the Bitcoin mining game. Again, something that you wouldn't find through normal security, but you certainly want to know about. Many of you may be in the business of either financing or creating businesses that involve IoT devices. And the tough thing is, you can try to secure quite a bit of it as the manufacturer. But as I mentioned, it's often the communications that could be the part that's insecure. Or it could be moving the data, storing the data in the cloud that make it less secure. There's multiple pieces in the IoT chain where there can be weaknesses or vulnerabilities. One of the things that Darktrace can do is we partner with IoT providers because your time to market is everything. And you don't want to have to go back to the drawing board and build new security into your process. You want to get to market. You want to start manufacturing at higher volumes. So we can partner with IoT providers to help provide this type of visibility into these attacks. In fact, it's one of the reasons that we work in partnership with Samsung. So now what I'd like to do is show you a very brief demonstration of how this works in action. So if we can switch to the phone here. So I just logged into the Darktrace application. Now, as you saw before, we have a very sophisticated screen that security operations centers at all different levels utilize. But we also had requests for someone who might not be a security expert to actually be able to use this on a mobile device. Or maybe it is an expert and they're just away from the data center, the security center. So basically we have here, we color code all the alerts, and we can actually see a summary of how many devices we're actually seeing in real time on the network. So in this case, we're modeling 30,871 devices, and that's across over 2,000 subnets in the network, giving us 1.4 million, roughly, patterns of life of devices. With that, it will sift through all of that information in real time. It will give us that probability by correlating weak indicators of threat. And we see that we have an unusual data transfer at 87%. We can go into that specific AI model, and we can actually say, this is an unusual data transfer. Do you want to acknowledge that this transfer is okay or not? And from there, we can actually go into what we call human confirmation mode. In this case, I want to be able to confirm that I want the digital antibodies to go into action, and I can go ahead and activate them, and they will take an automatic recommendation to quarantine that machine until a human can take a look at it and decide what to do about it. This particular case, It happened to have been a data scientist working for a company who was about to give notice to HR, had gathered up a number of their formulas, was attempting to make an external transfer of that data, and we were able to protect it before that happened. Thank you very much.